Welcome back to the Fat Loss Academy podcast. I'm your host, Josh Trinchini, and in today's episode, I'm going to be discussing everything that you sort of need to know about tracking your food intake. So I guess the first question that comes from this is, why would we want to track our food intake, or why would we do this in the first place? Now, over the last few episodes, we've already talked a lot about our calorie targets, and we've talked a lot about needing to create a calorie deficit for weight loss and all of that. And even in the last episode, I talked about what gets measured gets managed, and we can apply that same principle to our food intake as well. So if we know, what our calorie deficit target is, and we know the calories that we're trying to consume to lose weight and all of that sort of stuff, the only way that we're going to know whether we're consuming that amount of calories is actually by tracking our food intake, okay? But actually tracking our food intake, or actually knowing how many calories we are consuming without tracking our food intake, is really, really difficult. People are really bad at estimating what they eat. In fact, there are numerous studies out there that have reported that participants significantly underestimate how much they eat, and they can underreport their calorie intake by as much as 2,000 calories per day, while people can also overestimate how much they exercise or move per day by up to 72%. So you could see there are some pretty big discrepancies, okay? And this isn't just everyday normal people as well. This also goes out to people who are educated when it comes to their nutrition as well. So there was also a study which tested dietitians, and they found that dietitians underreported their energy intake from anywhere between 200 to 250 sort of calories per day on average, whereas people who weren't educated around, so people that aren't dietitians, they underreported their energy intake by even greater. It was like 300 to 500 plus calories per day. Okay, so the takeaway there is that even people who know already quite a lot about food, so people like your dietitians, nutritionists, personal trainers, etc., they are still pretty inaccurate when it comes to just trying to guess what their calorie intake is based off of the foods that they're eating, okay? So it just sort of goes to show that even if we think we know how many calories that we're consuming, we can actually be quite a long way off. And that is why tracking our food intake can be really, really beneficial, especially when we're trying to lose weight. All right, and that's why we're going to talk about this in today's episode. But first, I do just want to chat about a few of the common misconceptions that people can have when it comes to tracking their food intake. So oftentimes when you're talking to someone new about this, or to someone who's never done it before, and you ask them, why they haven't tried it before, or sort of what stops them from trying it, a lot of people say that it seems like it's something which is really difficult to do. And it can be, but it's usually not as hard as what people think. And I'll discuss some of the different methods that you can use in this episode. A lot of people think that in order to track their food intake, they need to be weighing and measuring absolutely everything that they're eating. And you can do that for sure. That is absolutely a part of it, but it's not necessarily something that you have to do. And again, something I'll touch on a little bit later in the episode, but one thing I always like to say to people when they first come to me and we start working together is that when it comes to making progress, I want people to do it in a way which is as easy as possible. Because if we just start doing all of the extreme stuff right away, it makes it really hard to make any sort of changes from there. Whereas if you just start making a few little changes to your lifestyle and then you start making progress, well, then that's great. But if that progress starts to stall, then at least we know we can start to change a few more things down the line and we can keep going. And it's not going to be too hard or too overwhelming in the beginning. So for example, if you do start weighing and measuring every single piece of food that you're eating, that's probably going to feel really overwhelming in the beginning, and it's probably not something which is necessary, at least right away. Another common misconception about tracking your food intake is that you need to be tracking your calories and your macros perfectly. And again, it's not absolutely necessary. It is a part of tracking your food intake, but it doesn't have to be the whole part of it. And typically that's sort of only based off of one method. But like I said, in today's episode, I'm going to talk about different methods of tracking your food intake. Another misconception is that it's only for weight loss. And that's definitely not true. A lot of people, obviously, if you're trying to gain weight, it can be really beneficial too. But it can also be really beneficial if you are just trying to improve your overall performance, or if you are just trying to educate yourself more around food and different foods and your food choices, etc. Another misconception is that it will lead to disordered eating. Now, tracking your food intake can definitely contribute to that for sure, but it's definitely not always going to happen. It's not always going to be the case. Okay. Now, depending on the person and maybe the method that you're doing or whatever it is, then it's maybe something that you definitely want to be aware of for sure and consider, but it's not always going to happen. And there's a lot of strong evidence out there which shows that people who do track their food intake don't develop disordered eating habits as well. And the last misconception is that you need to be hitting your macros every single day for it to be effective. And again, that is far from the case. Sort of like that point I touched on earlier, it's better to be, better to be doing it in a way which is as easy as possible, which doesn't necessarily mean being as perfect as possible. Okay. But again, a really common misconception is that if you're not perfect, then it's not going to work. And again, that is far from the case. So let's talk about some of the different benefits that we get from tracking our food intake, and then we'll touch on some of the different methods that we could use. So when you track your food intake and you use it as a tool, which is something I like to highlight, because when we think about tracking our food intake, we should be thinking of it as a tool that we are using to help educate ourselves and to help better ourselves. We shouldn't be thinking of something that we have to do and that we need to be doing, but just thinking of it as like a little handy tool that we can add on our tool belt as a part of this whole weight loss journey that we're on. But some of the benefits include that it helps educate us on the different makeup of different foods, and it can help show you, the nutritional value of foods. It can help you be a little bit less restrictive with your diet. So for example, a real common thing that I see is that when people first try to lose a little bit of weight is that they start to cut a lot of things out of their diet. However, when we start tracking our food intake, we start to learn that we can actually still include a lot of the things and a lot of the foods that we love within our diet and still make progress. And that's one of the biggest benefits that I see with most people. Another benefit is that it can actually help you prevent undereating and overeating. Okay, so when you start tracking your food intake, you actually start to get a bit of an idea and a more accurate picture of exactly how much and what you're eating. Like I said at the start of the episode about how difficult it is for people to actually report their food intake. Now, often a lot of people do underreport naturally, but sometimes we can overreport too. And obviously if we're undereating too much, then that can be a bit of an issue as well. Another benefit is that it can help with portion control. So tracking your food intake can help help you understand, different portions and just how much you should be eating, or what a portion of food actually might look like, which is suitable for you. And it can also help highlight deficiencies in your diet as well. I think one of the most common things that I see working with clients, especially in the beginning, is, if they do start tracking their food intake, a lot of people say to me, I think, I do consume enough protein. And then they start tracking their food intake and they realize that they're consuming 50 to 80 grams of protein a day, and they thought they were consuming a lot more. And that's just one prime example. But yeah, definitely tracking your food intake can highlight a lot of different deficiencies within your diet. So what are the different methods of tracking your food intake? There are quite a few, but I've sort of highlighted 4 in particular, which I would say are probably the most common or ones that I see a lot of. The first is using a food tracking app. So something such as MyFitnessPal, something on your phone where you can input all of the data in there. You can scan barcodes of different food items, things like that, and it provides you with the calories and the macronutrients of certain foods. The second option is a food diary. Now, this can be written or it can be done on an app as well. The third option is photos, so taking photos of your foods. And then the fourth option is a meal plan. So we're going to look at each of these individually. So that first one, using a food tracking app. Now, some of the most common ones include MyFitnessPal, Lose It, Carbon. There are heaps of different food tracking apps out there nowadays. They've become really, really popular. But I would say MyFitnessPal is probably the most popular one out there and the most commonly used. Essentially, what a food tracking app is somewhere where you go in and you log absolutely everything you eat. And you can do this by logging all of the individual ingredients. So, for example, let's say I had some cereal for breakfast this morning. Now, instead of just going and saying cereal for breakfast, I go into MyFitnessPal and I can log the brand of cereal I had. So let's say it's, Nutri-Grain, I can put that in there. I can log how much I had. So let's say it's a cup, or I could write 50 grams. I could log the milk that I had with it and how much milk as well. And what it's going to do is show me the overall calorie content of that meal and the macronutrients of those food items as well. Okay, so basically you're putting everything you ate in there and it's showing you just exactly how many calories are in that as well. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of using a food tracking app? Some of the pros include that it's really easy to use and quite convenient. So obviously if it's on your phone, now a con could also be that it's not easy to use, but again, it sort of depends on where you're at in your journey. But once you do start to learn how to use it, then generally they're quite easy. Another pro is that they're generally more accurate than other methods of tracking your food intake. Now, depending on how you track, but still they are quite accurate and they give you a pretty good idea of just how many calories you're consuming on a daily basis. The other pro is that they can teach you about the nutritional content of different foods. So for example, I might not know how many calories are in a piece of steak or an apple. All right, but when I log it into MyFitnessPal, it shows me how many calories are in that apple. It shows me how much protein, how many carbs, how much fat, etc. And I start to learn different things about different foods. So for example, I might have seen this chocolate bar before and just assumed, oh yeah, that chocolate bar, it's really high in calories. It's probably like 400 or 500 calories. But, then I scan it into MyFitnessPal and it shows me that it's, only 190 calories. And I start to, change my perspective and it starts to teach me the calorie content of different foods, which can be really, really beneficial. And over time, what you find is that by doing this and using this tool, you actually do just get really good and you get a lot better at eyeballing different foods. So like I talked about in the beginning of, dietitians versus just general population, the reason they are a lot more accurate at underreporting their food intake, even though they still weren't completely accurate, but they were more accurate than the general population, was because when you start to learn these things and you start to learn the different calorie contents of foods, it is a lot easier to eyeball things and then get a better idea of how many calories and what the macros of certain foods are. But some of the cons include that food tracking apps can be costly. Now, a lot of them are free or do have free features, but then a lot of them do have paid features, especially now over the last few years. I think because of the popularity, they've started to put a bit of a price tag on these things. They're not always entirely accurate. So as an example, something like MyFitnessPal, you could type in something like apple and there could be hundreds of different entries which pop up and it's hard to know which one's the most accurate one. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but just knowing that sometimes it doesn't always mean it's 100% accurate. It can also be really hard to add in non-packaged ingredients as well. So sort of just like I said. Now, for example, if you scan something which has a barcode on it, like like a Mars bar, for example, then it's going to be pretty accurate because you're going to get the nutritional info, which is printed on that label. Whereas when you do just add something in which doesn't have a barcode on it, like I said, like an apple or some Whole Foods or whatever it is, sometimes it can be a lot harder to get the right information. It can also be a bit harder when you're eating your own meals and recipes and things like that. So, if you are making all of your own food, which is really good and probably something I recommend if you are trying to lose weight, then sometimes it can be a little bit harder or a little bit more tedious to track all of that because then you have to go in and add every ingredient individually. And, then you have to sort of determine how much of what you're using, etc. And sometimes you can forget and things like that. And then, of course, I did add in here as well that it can become a bit of an unhealthy habit as well. And where I see this turn into an unhealthy habit is when the people develop a constant worry over their food choices, just ensuring that it can that they're hitting their targets, and that can lead to a bit of a sacrifice in the nutritional quality of foods to reach a goal. So like I said, for example, just there, sometimes it can be a little bit harder to, maybe add in whole foods and things like that because maybe it's a little bit more work, etc. So what you'll find is that maybe people are just eating a lot more processed foods or things like that, which are a lot easier to scan and fit into their calorie targets, and they know it's a lot more accurate, etc. And then sometimes, you can sort of have this thing where you're focused more on hitting the targets rather than focusing on overall health and nutritional quality. And that's a good place to point out that as well. I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but we have to remember as well that sometimes being in a calorie deficit doesn't necessarily equal optimal health as well. And sometimes it's going to be a lot harder to eat for optimal health while trying to lose a little bit of weight as well. Now, I'll always try to, get people to be as healthy as possible and follow a diet which is as healthy as possible when trying to lose weight. But sometimes it's not always super realistic as well. And that's something that we always have to consider too. So let's move on to the second method, which is a food diary. Now, essentially a food diary is essentially a daily log of what you eat and drink each day. And this can help you understand your eating habits. It can help you realize, what you consume, how much you're consuming, when you're consuming it. And when you are taking a food diary, typically what you do is you will record and take note of things like what food you eat, when you eat it, so what time of the day, where you are when you're eating it, who you're eating it with, so if you're eating it with anyone, and how you're feeling or how the food made you feel. So for example, I might jot down, I just had some Nutrigrain for breakfast with some milk, with some whole milk. I had this at the kitchen table at 8 a.m. I was by myself. I was quite tired before this meal, but when I ate it, started to feel a little bit better, started to feel a little bit more full and satisfied. Okay, so basically with a food diary, you are just sort of writing down, essentially, as accurately as possible, everything that you're eating. Okay, so let's look at the pros and cons of that. So obviously that is a lot easier to do. It's quite cost effective because you can just do it on a piece of paper. You can do it in a journal. You could also do it in your phone as well. For example, you could use the Notes app. And the good thing about this is that it tracks more than just the food alone. So like I sort of mentioned there, with a good food diary, you want to be doing things about where you're eating it, when you're eating the foods, how you're feeling, and if you're eating it with anyone as well. And why those things become really effective is because it starts to teach you a little bit more about your food habits rather than just the foods alone. And you can start to focus a little bit more on those habits. So for example, if I start to do a bit of a food diary and over the course of a couple of weeks, I start to notice, it's interesting because my food intake actually looks quite good overall. But every time on a Wednesday at 10 a.m. when I catch up with Jenny, I'm having a piece of chocolate cake. Maybe, because we're eating at this cafe, maybe it's who I'm eating it with or where I'm eating it is causing me to make that food decision. So maybe I could ask to catch up with Jenny somewhere else, or maybe we could meet at our place at home, and that way I could have a healthier option or something like that. So it teaches you a little bit more about your food intake rather than just the actual food that you're putting into your body, if that makes sense, which I find to be really, really effective and useful. But the cons with this is that it doesn't provide you with any nutritional information. So although you're writing down absolutely everything you're eating, it's still hard to know how many calories we're actually consuming. It's all well and good to write down that you had cereal for breakfast and some chicken for lunch, etc. But without really logging it, it can be difficult to know whether that total is 2,000 calories or 5,000 calories or whatever. It can also be difficult to know what changes to make based off of that as well. Now, because I might not know how much you're having of each meal. So if you're not recording the portions, or if you don't really have an accurate representation of exactly how much you're eating, then it can be difficult to know what changes to make. Because let's say you're recording your food diary and you're really consistent with it and you're doing it pretty accurately, but we're not making any progress, then chances are that's because we're not in a calorie deficit. So then we need to start making some changes to that. But it's going to be a little bit harder or a little bit more difficult to know where that is. Now, we'd probably make changes based off of the overall quantities of the meals that we're having. But again, that can be something sort of difficult to record on the food diary. The other thing as well is that it can be difficult to judge portions. Now, again, unless you are weighing everything out and measuring the foods that you're having, it can be difficult to know exactly how much it is. Now, Obviously, with a food diary, you could guess. So you could write, I had a cup and a half of, or I had a fistful of chicken breast. Okay, but it's not entirely accurate. Okay, so again, judging those portion sizes can be relatively difficult. The next method is food photos. So this is very similar to a food diary. Essentially, you're just taking photos of all of your meals and beverages that you consume. Okay, and again, this is just more of like a recall rather than sort of a diary. So it's just like you can look back on everything that you've had, but everything is pretty similar to the food diary. So I won't go into too much more detail about that one. And then the fourth method is a meal plan. Now, this isn't necessarily a way of tracking your food intake per se, but it is a way of knowing what and how much you are consuming. Okay, so if you do get a meal plan from a professional like a dietitian or a nutritionist, then the chances are all of the amounts and all of the calories and macronutrients have been taken care of for you. Okay, so this helps simplify the process and it helps take out a lot of the guesswork. So chances are is that if you are following that plan to an absolute T, then you are hitting your calorie and macro target. So you don't necessarily have to do too much thinking outside of that, and which means you don't really have to track your food intake outside of that. But a couple of the cons with this one is that it might not be completely accurate, especially if it's not followed correctly. For example, someone could have on the meal plan a specific recipe, but you might use ingredients which are slightly different to that recipe. Now, it doesn't sound like that would make a big change, but there are definitely certain ingredients which, if I use ingredient A versus ingredient B, the calorie amounts and the macro amounts can be pretty different, which can add up over the course of a week or multiple meals. The other con is that it doesn't really teach you much else about food or portions. Okay, you don't really learn much about, the nutritional value of foods. You don't really learn much about what portions are going to be good for you other than the particular foods that you're eating. So it really just maybe helps you have a better understanding of what's on that meal plan, but not much else outside of that meal plan. And that can lead to it being quite restrictive as well, because obviously you're probably just going to be sticking to foods on that meal plan, which is likely going to be cutting out a lot of different foods or meals as well. And that means, that's going to have issues with sustainability and you're probably not going to be able to stick to that for a long time. They can also be a little bit costly as well, and they can obviously get quite boring and repetitive too as well if you are eating pretty much similar things or similar meals. And again, like I said, because it's not teaching you much else outside of what's on that meal plan, then when you do start to consume things outside of that meal plan, then it's likely that you're maybe not going to be making progress, or you could be hindering your progress as well. So let's talk about some of the common challenges that we face when we track our food intake, and then some tips to help avoid or help work around those challenges. So the first one is forgetting to log our food, and this is something which I see happen quite often. Now, there's sort of three main ways that we can help navigate this challenge. The first one, which is my absolute favorite and is one I try and get a lot of people to focus on, and a habit that I try and get a lot of people to build, is tracking their food intake in advance. Now, this is really good for numerous reasons. The first is that when you do this, obviously it's done and then you don't have to worry about it, because when we try and track our food intake as we go, we often forget. Chances are you'll get busy or something will pop up and you'll go, all right, I'll just do that again later, but we forget about it, and then it can be really, really difficult to remember what you ate. If I ask you, okay, what did you guys all eat last Wednesday at 3 p.m. after lunch? What did you snack on? Chances are you're not really going to remember that, or it's not going to be as accurate because you don't remember how much or whatever it is. So there's that reason. The other reason that tracking in advance is really beneficial is that it helps create a little bit of a plan and some structure for you to follow. So, when I'm trying to hit a certain calorie target because I'm trying to lose a little bit of weight, knowing what I'm going to be eating for the day and knowing that what I've planned to eat is going to help hit my calorie target really makes it a lot easier for me, rather than trying to track my food intake as I go, and then I get later in the day and I realize, oh, I've only got 300 calories left to work with. Now I have to try and, magically fit some different foods into this just to reach the target. Whereas if I've done it in advance, then I know I've already got everything planned out and I can just stick to that plan and I know it's going to hit my goals. And that just gives us a little bit of structure to follow, which helps, again, take out a little bit of the guesswork. So it's almost like a personalized meal plan in a sense. The other thing with tracking in advance is that it just allows you to reach those calorie and macro targets and know that you've hit them. Okay, so again, a lot of the times I'll see people who just go about tracking their food intake as they go, and they'll get to a little bit later in the day and they'll realize, oh, I've either got like a lot of calories to make up or I don't have many calories left at all. And then, you have to start making these weird changes to your foods just to try and hit those calorie numbers. Whereas tracking in advance, it's already done, it's already taken care of, and you can make adjustments to it still as you go, but at least you've sort of got the basis to work off of there. Now, the other tip to help with, when people forget to log their food is just trying to create a little bit of a routine. So if you create a routine by doing it, at a similar time each day or in a similar place each day, then it makes it a lot easier to stick to. So for example, a lot of people they might have logging their food intake as a part of their nighttime routine. So let's say you finish dinner, you sit down for a few minutes and you do the next day then, or you do it first thing in the morning with your cup of coffee. And to help with this, the other tip is that you can set a reminder as well. So if you need a bit of a prompt, then setting a reminder would be useful. And this could be as simple as, setting a reminder on your phone to go off at a specific time each day, or maybe putting a sticky note in a place that you look at quite often. And essentially what this is then is habit stacking. And once we start to build that habit in, it makes the process a lot easier. Now, the second challenge that I see a lot of people make is incorrect or inaccurate food entries. So when they're tracking their food intake, what they're tracking is either incorrect or it's inaccurate. Now, oftentimes, one reason for this is that a lot of people don't want to admit, but when they log their food intakes, they want the outcome to look good and they want it to look healthier than what it might be. But sometimes our food intake and our food choices may not align, so we try to make them align. Okay, and we do this by choosing entries that maybe resemble the foods that we ate, or has more favorable calorie amounts, or maybe sometimes we just don't input things which don't reach our calorie target. So let's say, for example, my calorie goal is 2,000 calories per day, but I've gone out and I've eaten and I've had my meal and I've hit my 2,000 calories, but then I have a few extra beers or something. And, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I just won't input those beers because then it's going to skew the data a little bit and it's going to make my calorie intake look a lot higher than what it is. Now, it sounds silly because you're sort of just shooting yourself in the foot, but it is very, very common. So when we're doing our food tracking or whatever it is, first thing that we have to remember is that we don't expect to be perfect right away. And like I said a little while ago at the start of the episode, ideally, if we can make as much progress as possible without being perfect or without putting in as much effort, then that is the ideal scenario, okay? Because we're getting the output with as little input as possible, okay? So don't feel the need to try and make everything look perfect because it's not necessary for the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now, we shouldn't, with that, try to make things just look good for the sake of it either, okay? Because again, you're just sort of shooting yourself in the foot, and then what's going to happen is over time, you're going to start to wonder, well, I'm doing everything perfectly, but I'm not making any progress. What gives? And you think, that tracking your food intake or being in a calorie deficit doesn't work, when in reality, you've sort of just been lying with yourself or, haven't been helping yourself. Now, that's one element of incorrect and inaccurate food entries, but another element is also just sometimes error as well, okay? Or sometimes we don't know how to do it correctly, or sometimes we choose different options. So one thing that can help with this is sometimes just overestimating. So for example, if I go to track a particular food and I've got a bunch of options which pop up, sometimes just choosing the lowest calorie option isn't going to be the best one. Maybe it's better if I overestimate and I choose the option which is a little bit higher in calories. Okay, that might skew my data still and make it look worse than what it is, but if I'm still making progress, then I'd rather take that, because then at least I know that I'm closer than what if I was just underestimating the whole time, because then it's going to make it look like I'm eating very, very little calories when that might not actually be the case. Another really useful tip is to use a food database. So for example, in Australia, we have NUTAB, which is the nutrient table for use in Australia. And essentially this is just a reference. It's a database which has a bunch of nutrients on there, and different foods and things like that, which has been provided by an Australian body. Okay, so for example, like I talked about in that example before of tracking an apple. So if you type in an apple in MyFitnessPal, for example, there's going to be like 10 to 15 different options. Well, it's going to be more than that, which pop up, and they're all going to have varying calorie amounts. Whereas if I type in apple, then NUTAB, what's going to pop up is that specific one, which has been referenced in the Australian nutrient table. So that one we know is going to be a little bit more accurate, and that just helps us, again, just, I guess, choose a more accurate option each time rather than just guessing at random. Now, the other tip as well is to weigh or measure our foods as well, and that is going to help improve the accuracy of our food entries too. I also said a little bit earlier before as well is just overestimating as well, but you can also guesstimate too. So if you're not 100% sure of the food entry you're making, then sometimes you just do need to make a little bit of an educated guess as well. And what's going to happen is the more you practice these things, you are going to get better at it over time. So like I said before, don't expect to be perfect right away. But I remember when I first started tracking my food intake, how I did it back then to how I do it now is wildly different. But the reason that I improved over time was because I just made these little mistakes and I started to learn from them. So the best thing is to just keep practicing, and slowly over time, you will definitely get better with it. Now, the third challenge that I see a lot of people make is navigating food choices which are outside of their planned meals. So, for example, like I said, really good to track in advance and do all of those things. But let's say I go out for dinner tonight and I don't know where I'm going, and I eat something randomly. Sometimes tracking that can be really difficult, and this can be something which throws a lot of people off and can force a lot of people to stop tracking their food intake altogether, because they're just like, well, what's the point? It's not going to be accurate, or I don't know how to do it, and whatever it is. And I sort of refer back to what I just said, which is guesstimating can be really, really good here. Yes, sometimes it's not going to be completely perfect, but as long as you have a little bit of a guess, it can give you a rough idea of where you're at, but it also helps you just keep the habit of food tracking as well, which can be really beneficial. Another good option is to use a similar source as a reference point. So, for example, if I'm just going out to some random Italian restaurant to have pizza, that's not going to be on the food logging app. And when I type in pizza, there's going to be heaps of different options on there, and it's going to be really hard to know if this one is similar to what's on the tracking app. But what I can do is use a bit of a similar source for a reference point. So for example, maybe I'll type in Domino's Pizza, because I know that is going to be on the tracking app, and I can, use that as a rough estimate for the pizza that I'm having. Now, obviously, no, it's not going to be perfect. They're not going to be that similar, but it's just a rough idea, and I'm going to be close enough, okay? And it's going to help me keep that habit there, and I can still make estimates based off of that, okay? And again, the other tip here is to just try and overestimate as well. So obviously I'm not going to go in and just put in, if I'm having 6 or 7 slices of this pizza at this Italian restaurant, I'm not just going to put in 2 slices of Domino's Pizza. I might likely overestimate that. And again, just give myself a little bit of a buffer. And the fourth one is the common challenge that people face is that it can be time consuming. Now, in the beginning, yes, it can be, especially when you're new to it, but it absolutely gets better with practice as well. Okay, so the more you do it, you'll be surprised at how quick you can get at using this. Again, it can also be really important and really useful to track in advance, because that saves you a bunch of time. Whereas if you're trying to track and record your food intake as you go, then yeah, that can be quite time consuming, especially if you're trying to remember things, then you're like not sure of what ingredients you use, etc. Then you have to like catch up on a lot of things. So yeah, tracking in advance really helps there. Another important tip is to reuse common and popular entries that you do. So for example, if you're having similar things for breakfast or for lunch each day, then save those. And then instead of having to re-enter those every single day, you can simply input that from your saved items list, which saves you a bunch of time. And then the last point I've got around this one is just remember that some discomfort on your fat loss journey is necessary. So sometimes, I've had a lot of people come to me and they say, I don't want to track my food intake, and fair enough. Okay. Like they don't want all that stress and effort as well. But then, people just start to make a bunch of excuses. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And look, at the end of the day, if you want to make a change, yes, you do have to put in a little bit of work. And sometimes that might mean you have to track your food intake, or you have to do some other things that you don't want to do. Okay. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes we have to put in a little bit of effort. And that is just, I think, something which I've seen a lot more of lately is that people just make fat loss seem a little bit easier than what it is in reality. Like we're living in a society and environment now where it's actually a lot harder to achieve our goals, and that, based off of our environment and, the access that we have to food these days and everything. So, but all these people on social media make it seem so easy and so simple, and that you can do it with so little change and such little effort. And yes, obviously we want to make as much progress with as little effort as possible, but that doesn't mean no effort is required as well. And that's just an important point I wanted to reiterate. So just to round out this episode, tracking your food intake, some of the key takeaways. It's really important to think of it as a tool. So it's not something that we have to do for food, for weight loss, but it can be something that we use as a tool to help us on our journey. Now, I've obviously talked about a few different methods in this episode. You don't have to use those methods. You don't have to use any one particular one of those methods. You maybe, one method will work better for someone else, whereas the other might work better for someone else. But, at least you got a rough idea. It can be really important to be honest with yourself when you're tracking your food intake as well. Again, I know we always want to make ourselves look better than what we maybe are, but being honest is going to lead to the most success. Tracking your food intake in advance is super, super useful. Practice, because the more you practice it, the better it gets. And again, don't expect it to be perfect in the beginning. Chances are you're going to be probably pretty inaccurate at the beginning when you start, but the only way you get better is by doing it more, and it will become a lot more accurate. Like I said at the end there, save common and regular meals and recipes that you're using. So save those, or make a note of those. And then, don't expect or aim to be perfect to round it out. So thank you guys for tuning into today's episode. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into tracking your food intake. I know I didn't necessarily specifically talk about how to track your food intake. I sort of just covered a bunch of different methods in general. But if you would like me to get into the specifics in a little bit more detail, then definitely be sure to let me know. And be sure to share this episode with someone if you think they might enjoy it or if they might find it useful. And if you can leave a review and subscribe, then that would be great too. Otherwise, I'll catch you all in the next episode. Make sure if you have any questions, send an email to contact@thefatlosacademy.com.au, and I'll catch you all then.